So, Metroid Prime 4 continues to be a mystery, but you guys know me, that will not stop me from talking about and theorizing about it still. So the topic I want to discuss with you guys today, as the title suggests, has to do with the potential timeline that Metroid Prime 4 takes place, which in many ways might seem obvious, but also, at least in my brain, could be up for debate. And of course, as the title even further suggests, we're comparing the timeline possibilities for Metroid Prime 4 most specifically to Metroid Dread, which might seem silly in some ways, but don't worry, I'm going to get into that in this video. Even though this is probably going to be very familiar and well known to most of you who would find and watch this video, I think it could be helpful for us to revisit what the Metroid timeline actually looks like to understand where Metroid Prime 4 will most likely fall, but also how and why I think it might fall in a different time, again, all in relation to Metroid Dread. As we can see, and as many of us know, there are the two main kind of stories and timelines in the Metroid universe. There's the mainline games, Metroids 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There are definitely some spin-off titles smattered throughout those as well. But most importantly, we also look at the Metroid Prime trilogy of games, the Metroid Prime story. Those, most famously, as we can see, actually take place and occur between the original Metroid and Metroid 2. And of course, as we can also see, Metroid Dread, the most recent brand new Metroid game released in 2021, is Metroid number 5, and that currently takes place at the very end of the timeline. It is the furthest in the story within the universe and lore of the Metroid franchise that any game has ever gone. It started with Metroid 1 on the NES. A ton of different games have happened between then and Metroid Dread, which now is the very end of the current timeline as we know it. And so then we come back to Metroid Prime 4, which is the only confirmed new Metroid game we know that they're making. Insanely exciting, still mysterious. 6 years later, all we know about was the reboot that happened in 2019, and that the game was given back to Retro Studios, and we're waiting to learn more about it. As you've heard me theorize multiple times over the course of the past 2 or so years, I currently am predicting, which is only a prediction and guess, I always have to remind you guys of this, my guess and prediction is that Metroid Prime 4 will probably be a cross-gen title that releases with a Switch and a next-gen Nintendo console version. I am assuming and hoping that that comes out next year, fingers crossed, because boy, am I ready to play that game. And so when we consider that the Metroid Prime trilogy of games takes place between Metroids 1 and Metroid 2, which again is well before Metroid Dread, of course, which is at the end of the timeline, and I'm really hoping this makes sense for maybe anyone who isn't already familiar with the timeline. I know for those of us who are deep Metroid fans and have great knowledge of the timeline, this probably all makes sense and it's second nature. But for newcomers, other than staring at the timeline in the beginning of this video, it might get a little bit complicated and confusing as I describe it. So I hope it's just kind of easy to follow along for any of you guys who might be watching. And so again, with the Prime games taking place so far before Metroid Dread in the timeline, you would assume that Metroid Prime 4 will do the same. More than likely, Metroid Prime 4 will take place as a direct sequel to Metroid Prime 3, meaning by the time Prime 4 comes out, the timeline will look like Metroid 1 on the NES, then Metroid Prime 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then Metroid 2 continuing to take place then, right after the events of Metroid Prime 4. More than likely, Primes 1 through 4 will all take place between Metroid 1 and Metroid 2. However, even though I think that more than likely that will be the case, I think it is also fun to explore the possibility of how Metroid Prime 4, if Nintendo is going to take a big swing with this game and do something crazy and surprise us, how the game might actually end up taking place after Metroid Dread. And I know that on its surface that might seem A, silly, and B, just stupid or even impossible. I don't really think that that's necessarily the case. We kind of have a tendency to forget, I think, as fans of gaming and movies and all these fictional stories, that by the time the writers first sit down to put pen to paper for any story they're telling, again, in a video game or in a movie, there's a lot of freedom. I mean, some rules might dictate where the story has to go, or maybe will even dictate some things that can't be possible. But you would be surprised how many things are actually possible whenever the storytellers want to tell something new. And with Metroid Prime 4, again, I'm acknowledging it makes the most sense to be a direct sequel to 3, and it probably will be a direct sequel to 3. However, I do think there is a chance Nintendo might do something that, in my opinion, would actually be kind of cool, and actually move Metroid Prime 4's story way in the future, way after the events of Metroid Prime 3, and make it a game that takes place in the timeline after Metroid Dread, furthest in the timeline, but it could also still theoretically be a direct story connection to Metroid Prime 3, which would explain why the game itself is, of course, Metroid Prime 4. So obviously, one of the best ways to theorize and predict this would be to really dive into a lot of the story options for Metroid Prime 4, because naturally, what the story of that game is going to be will have a huge impact on where in the timeline it's meant to fall. However, I don't really want to spend too much time in this video going really deep into story possibilities. I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I actually will make a video about that sometime in the nearish future that is dedicated just to story possibilities. I don't really want that to be this video and this conversation, other than to touch on one key point, which is how Metroid Prime 3 ends. Of course, this will be a bit of a spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't completed Metroid Prime 3 and is still watching this video and curious about this topic. It's not like a huge deal. The story isn't the most important part to Metroid games, but it is very interesting, and the lore of the Metroid Prime trilogy is certainly fascinating, and it's why those are my favorite games of all time. So I'm just going to let you know I'm going to spoil the very end little moment of Metroid Prime 3, because I think most of us Metroid fans also believe that it's going to feed into the story of Metroid Prime 4. And so, of course, at the end of Metroid Prime 3, after Samus has defeated the Aurora 313 unit and Dark Samus, we see a ship that belongs to another known bounty hunter called Psylux, who currently has only ever appeared in Metroid Prime Hunters on the DS, and we see his ship rise up and then shoot off to follow Samus. So it's just a little bit of a tease and an Easter egg at the end of the game to say, hey, maybe the story could continue, or hey, there's this other threat out there from this character that you know if you know the extended universe of the Metroid lore, and this character is following Samus, and so here's a threat that's going to be still pursuing her after the events of Metroid Prime 3. Of course, I said Psylux only appeared in Metroid Hunters, and that's not really technically true, because he actually did appear at the very end of Metroid Prime Federation Force, 3DS spin-off game as well, stealing a baby Metroid, so that also, I think, is going to feed into some implications into the story of Metroid Prime 4. But that's going too down the rabbit hole that I don't want to talk about here. When we look at the main idea of the trilogy ending, but we see Psylux is chasing after Samus in some way, we've never revisited that. So again, whether Metroid Prime 4, here's where my opinion comes into play on how the game could take place in either part of the timeline. Whether Metroid Prime 4 picks up like days after the end of Metroid Prime 3, or if it picks up years after Metroid Prime 3, again, maybe taking place even after the events of Metroid Dread, I think that more than likely, Psylux catching up to Samus is going to be the general conceit of the story of Prime 4, right? I mean, unless Nintendo is just abandoning that plot thread altogether, more than likely we all expect that to be the main hook, or one of the main hooks, to the story and the events of Metroid Prime 4. And so, what I like to think is that whether Prime 4 is days or years after Prime 3, we will see Psylux catch up to Samus to kick off the events of Metroid Prime 4, and I think that there's a chance. If Nintendo wanted to take Prime 4 and shoot it way into the future after the events of Metroid Dread, I still think that could work, because I think they could write a story where Metroid Prime 3 ended, and then all of the other Metroid games happen after that. Metroid 2, Metroid 3, Metroid 4, Metroid Other M, of course, and then Metroid 5. And then after Metroid 5 being Metroid Dread, that's when we finally see Psylux has caught up to Samus. Maybe it just takes him a long time to either catch up to her or to reveal to her that he's been following her. And so, if we explore the idea of Metroid Prime 4 taking place after Dread, and Psylux takes years to catch up to Samus, or like I said, years to just reveal that he's been following her, because maybe he's just been hiding in secret, watching the events that she's done in the times between Prime 3 and Prime 4. I think it could be one or the other. So then we come down to, why would Nintendo even choose to set the game after Metroid Dread if this theory turned out to be true? Well, to me, I think it could be a really smart way for them to continue the momentum that Metroid Dread introduced, or reintroduced, I should say, into the Metroid franchise. The game was very popular, it was a huge hit, it became the best-selling game in the franchise in only 6 months' time. It was nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards, it won Best Action Game of the Year, and it's got people paying attention to Metroid again for the first time since the Prime Trilogy games themselves were releasing in the mid to early 2000s. I mean, think about it. It was 02, 04, and 07 for the Metroid Prime Trilogy. So, you know, the middle chunk of the 2000s. It's been over 15 years. It's been over 20 years since the first Metroid Prime game even. And so with Metroid Dread having people interested in Metroid again, I think there's a great chance for Nintendo to take advantage of the events of that game, a game that a lot of people made their first ever Metroid game, and they can continue the story and the interest that people have in Metroid because of Dread and carry it on into Prime 4. I mean, it might be a little confusing and strange for the millions of newcomers to Metroid after Dread released to set the game back in the past, and people will be like, why are things different? I don't understand. The suit thing has changed and what's going on. I think that it could be smart for them from a business sense and from a story sense. Not to mention, from a gameplay perspective, there is a massive, massive advantage that I don't think anyone else is thinking about for Nintendo to set Metroid Prime 4 after the events of Metroid Dread. And this, again, is also going to be a spoiler for Metroid Dread. So I'm warning you now, I'm going to spoil a major reveal and a major thing that happens at the very end of Metroid Dread. Skip ahead a little bit if you want, but I'm just letting you know now I'm going to talk about this. So, here's the thing. Metroid Dread at the very end introduced the Metroid suit. It introduced the idea of Samus basically becoming the last living Metroid, which was the coolest, most incredible thing. I even predicted that like many months before the game came out, because I just thought that it could make sense based on other quotes that Sakamoto was saying at the time. And that turned out to be exactly where they were going with Dread. Samus defeats Ravenbeak, technically her father. She becomes one with the Metroid. You know, she becomes one with the X-Parasite as well, so there's a lot going on with Samus. She's a totally changed woman by the time that game ends. And they also show that she can transform her suit, that was the fusion suit and is basically tied to her DNA, into a Metroid suit. And it made for this incredible finale to that game. It was so cool. And so, if Nintendo were to set Metroid Prime 4 after Metroid Dread, that means they could incorporate the Metroid suit as part of the gameplay experience. Think of how insane that is. I mean, they could go so many ways with it. Maybe it's something you could almost temporarily activate, almost like going Super Saiyan temporarily, you know? Samus goes Super Saiyan, but in the Metroid universe, that means she activates the Metroid suit, and she becomes like an unstoppable force for a certain amount of time, and maybe the Metroid suit power is something you yourself can upgrade as you play throughout the game. It's all just incredibly exciting to me, and what a great way to take advantage of that huge change to the story and to Samus at the end of Dread than by setting Prime 4 after the events of that game. And so the last point I want to make with this whole idea and this whole concept is how Nintendo could even have planned this, right? Because you might be thinking, wait a minute, they started Metroid Prime 4 before Metroid Dread, right? So how could they do that? Well, that's when I say not so fast. They rebooted the game in 2019, we can't forget. And that would have been 2 years, or I guess around the time that they were actually starting development on Metroid Dread as well. Because we can't forget, Mercury Steam made and released Metroid Samus Returns on the 3DS the exact same year that Metroid Prime 4 was announced in 2017. And as we then learned, Nintendo and Sakamoto went back to Mercury Steam and said, hey, we want you to also make Metroid 5, we want you to make Metroid Dread. So by the time 2019 rolls around, and Nintendo realized we need to scrap this version of Metroid Prime 4 and reboot it with Retro Studios, well, in theory, and I'm only guessing here, this is just my speculation, but if you track the timeline and the events that we know of, they probably already knew, or they could have consulted with Mercury Steam on what they were doing with Metroid Dread and decided, okay, we know what you're doing with this Metroid Dread story. We understand Samus will be the last Metroid. She's going to have a Metroid suit by the end. Now we can write our Metroid Prime 4 game way in the future after the events of your game Metroid Dread, and we can take this Metroid suit concept and maybe other story and gameplay elements from that game, and we can incorporate it into Metroid Prime 4, so that Prime 4 could, in a way, serve as a literal sequel to both Metroid Prime 3 and to Metroid Dread. To me, it's an insanely exciting and cool idea. I mean, Nintendo could go either direction with this stuff, and again, if I was a betting man, I would probably still bet on Nintendo just making the game another prequel, setting it back in the past. It's a direct sequel to 3, it takes place before Metroid 2, and they're probably going to do that. And honestly, that'll be great. I can't wait. I'm just as excited for that as the other. But I can't deny the idea of making Metroid Prime 4 a way in the future sequel to Prime 3, continue the story beats from that game as they need to, Space Pirates, Phazon, Metroid Prime and or Dark Samus, Psylux, continue the stuff from the first 3 Prime games, but also continue the stuff from Metroid Dread and make Prime 4 the next newest game in the timeline, and you're just doing so much more to set up the future success for the Metroid franchise too by not jumping around in the timeline anymore. I think that even though the Metroid Prime series and the numbered series are not the same, they're in the same timeline, they're running parallel to each other. I think that setting Prime 4 after Dread just accomplishes a lot of things. I think it kills many birds with one stone, if that makes sense. And again, I just want to see a Samus that's now fully Metroid and also fully merged with the X-Parasite and having access to that Metroid suit and doing that in a Prime game. I want to see what happens after Dread. Yes, I'm excited to go back in the past as well, but I just think it's so exciting to think about Nintendo doing something like this and playing with the timeline for Metroid Prime 4. So, like I said, all theory, all speculation. I'm just a fan guessing and putting pieces together based off of what I know of the franchise and the story and the timeline. So this is what I think. This excites me. Does this make sense to you guys? I want to hear what you think. And with that, I'll see you next time on another video.